John Parker's life had been relatively tranquil since his wife, Melanie, passed away 5 years prior. He devoted the majority of his days to the completion of minor undertakings in the vicinity of his modest ranch-style residence in Springfield, Missouri. The residence was situated at the terminus of a gravel road, surrounded by expansive fields and the occasional cluster of oak trees. It was a straightforward existence, one that afforded ample opportunity for contemplation and loneliness. The day that everything changed began as any other began. John was seated at the neighborhood diner, where he and Melanie would typically enjoy crepes on Saturday mornings. He was absorbed in thought as he savored his coffee, when a headline in the day-old newspaper captured his attention. 2 children left behind, young parents allege local tragedy. He reviewed the article on 2 separate occasions. Caleb, 10, and Mason, 7, had lost their parents in an automobile tragedy that occurred just outside of town. They were currently in the foster care system, as no close relatives had come forward to claim them. John placed the paper on the table and gazed out the window at the parking lot of the diner. He felt a severe discomfort in his thorax that did not subside rapidly. He recalled Melanie's remarks, which were spoken on numerous occasions during their dreams of having children. Perhaps we are intended to assist someone who requires our assistance if we are unable to obtain our own. Although she had been absent for an extended period of time, her voice appeared to reverberate throughout the room. Adoption documents were dispersed across the desk as John sat in his lawyer's office 2 weeks later. He had never anticipated making such a decision. However, once the concept had taken hold, there was no turning back. He was not merely adopting 2 boys, he was also extending his heart and home to a future that he was unable to fully anticipate. The counsel, an elderly man with graying hair, raised his eyebrow as he signed his name on the dotted line. "You are aware that the residents of this area are inclined to engage in conversation," he stated. "Are you certain about this?" John's hand momentarily paused before he resumed writing. He replied with firmness, "Allow them to express themselves." John experienced a combination of anxiety and determination as he exited the office, the documentation completed. For the first time in years, he was not merely existing, he had a purpose. The initial encounter with Caleb and Mason transpired at the children's home, a brick structure situated on the periphery of Springfield. There was a faint aroma of disinfectant and cafeteria food in the air, and the gentle murmur of children's conversation reverberated through the hallways. As John waited, his palms were resting on his knees as he sat in a plastic chair. John stood when the guys finally entered. The elder sibling, Caleb, was the first to enter. His eyes, which were dark and cautious, perused the room before settling on John. Caleb's posture was already characterized by a sense of burden, as if the entire world was resting on his diminutive shoulders, even at the age of 10. Mason's steps were hesitant as he clutched to his brother's clothing behind him. He appeared diminutive and vulnerable at the age of 7. However, John was unable to disregard the fascination that was evident in his gaze. John greeted the guys with a steady voice, despite the apprehensive energy that was coursing through his body. "My name is John Parker." Caleb did not respond immediately. He examined John, as if he were attempting to determine whether this individual was merely another in a succession of transient adults. Mason, on the other hand, murmured to his brother, who gave a subtle assent before advancing. Caleb's voice was steady yet gentle as he inquired, "Are you truly intending to take both of us?" John lowered himself to Caleb's eye level. He stated unequivocally, "That is the sole method by which this is feasible. Mason and you are a package deal." Mason's lips trembled as he emerged from behind Caleb. He inquired, his voice scarcely discernible, "For how long?" John responded with a firm "for good," his words resonating throughout the room. "This is not a temporary arrangement. I am committed to the long term. You and your brothers will share a residence with me." The words were suspended in the air, laden with anticipation. The lads appeared uncertain about whether or not to believe him for a brief period. However, something changed shortly thereafter. Mason released Caleb's shirt and advanced, his diminutive hand extended. John proceeded without hesitation. The boy's hand was clasped in his own, and he could sense the trust and fragility in the act. Only the sound of gravel cracking beneath the truck's tires interrupted the tranquil voyage home. In the rear seat, Caleb and Mason were seated in close proximity, their compact luggage held securely. John's chest tightened with a combination of protectiveness and uncertainty as he regarded them in the rearview mirror. Mason spoke for the first time since leaving the children's home as they entered the driveway. "It is substantial," he stated, gazing at the residence. John responded uncomplicatedly. "It is my residence." He escorted the lads into the building and demonstrated their shared bedroom. It was compact yet inviting, featuring twin mattresses that were identical. Additionally, there is a window that provides a view of the courtyard. Mason sat on one of the beds, slightly bouncing on the mattress, while Caleb carefully placed his knapsack down, his eyes scouring the room. John cleared his throat. He began, his voice subdued and steady. "Listen, I understand that this is all new, and may be a little scary. However, I would like to emphasize that this is not a temporary situation. This is your current residence, and I will remain by your side indefinitely." John briefly considered resisting as Caleb's mandible contracted, but the youngster then gave a slight assent. Mason, in the meantime, murmured, "Can you make a commitment?" John's voice was solid as he uttered, "I promise." He was aware that he had made the correct decision at that moment. The obstacles that lie ahead would be confronted collectively. John was confronted with challenges that he had not anticipated during the initial weeks. It was evident that Caleb and Mason had endured more in their brief lives than most adults could fathom. Caleb was notorious for suppressing his emotions, and he seldom spoke unless he was directly addressed. Mason, on the other hand, was characterized by a high level of nervous energy, which resulted in abrupt weeping, or bursts of hilarity, that appeared to be more of a defensive measure than genuine pleasure. Then, there was the metropolis. Springfield was not a location where secrets were kept hidden. Whispers began to emanate almost immediately. At the supply store, John's grocery cart was observed by a neighbor, containing children's cereals and snacks. Her expression was a combination of bewilderment and judgment. The congregation was abuzz at worship. When John entered the room with the lads, their youthful features were conspicuous against a sea of familiar ones. The murmurs were not long in coming, evolved into more overt actions. The paint was unexpectedly unavailable at the supply store. John required the guys' chamber. Each booth was inexplicably reserved by a nearby diner. When John and the lads visited for brunch, he detected murmurs during town council meetings, in which individuals communicated using a concealed language regarding atypical families, as well as the preservation of the community. On a particular occasion, Caleb and Mason were engaged in a game of basketball in the driveway. As an elderly couple passed by, the sight caused their pupils to narrow. The husband murmured something to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "He will harbor remorse," he declared. John, who had been tidying equipment in the garage, just as Caleb was in the midst of a dribble, he stepped outside. The boy's expression was deliberately expressionless. However, John observed the tension in his shoulders. He approached, firmly placing his hand on Caleb's shoulder. John advised, "Do not listen to them." His voice was unwavering. "Some individuals speak because they are unable to think. You are present because you are a part of this community. Do not allow anyone to convince you otherwise." Caleb nodded. However, John was able to discern the youngster was having difficulty accepting the information. The most challenging period was at night. Mason experienced vibrant, frightful visions that caused him to flee into John's room in sobs. The initial instance of this occurred. John sat beside him on the edge of the bed. His limb was encased in protective clothing around the boy's quivering frame. "Was the accident the subject?" John inquired gently. Mason acknowledged. Burying his forehead in John's bosom, he murmured, "I miss them." John acknowledged. "I am aware that you do." He spoke with a voice that was saturated with emotion. "It is permissible to be absent from their presence. It is acceptable to experience feelings of melancholy. However, I am currently present, Mason. You are not alone." Mason's grip was increasingly tense upon him, and for the first time, John felt as though he was on the brink of making a breakthrough. The barriers that the guys had constructed around their souls. Nevertheless, Caleb was an entirely distinct narrative. The youngster exuded a subdued toughness that hindered John's comprehension of his emotions. On a particular occasion, in the process of repairing a damaged stair on the veranda, Caleb approached him, a tiny wooden case in one's hand. "What is this?" John inquired. "He is cleaning his hands on his trousers." Caleb hesitated. Before transferring the carton, photographs were contained within the container. an assortment of family photographs and candid photographs of his parents. "I am not yet ready for Mason to view these," Caleb whispered. "He is not prepared." John cautiously closed the box as he nodded. "You are a good big brother," he stated. "You are responsible for his well-being." Caleb shook his head. However, there was a momentary glimmer of something in his eyes. Perhaps confidence. "It is simply my habit." In spite of the obstacles, there were minor victories. Mason began to exhibit more genuine mirth, the type that emanated warmth throughout the residence. Caleb, who was perpetually earnest, demonstrated enthusiasm for John's construction endeavors, observing with great attention as John discussed the process of sanding and staining wood. The boy's recovery was progressing gradually but steadily. John was aware that the impending journey would be difficult. However, for the first time, he experienced a sliver of optimism. Spring arrived early that year, introducing days that are milder and skies that are livelier. John perceived it as an opportunity to entice the guys involved in the community. In spite of the skepticism that persisted in the municipality, he registered them for juvenile activities, Mason for soccer and Caleb for basketball, and determined that they would all contribute. At the forthcoming town cleanup day, first ever competition day, did not proceed as efficiently as John had anticipated. Dear Caleb, while sporting his newly issued basketball uniform, entered the court with his team, only to be greeted with blank expressions from the parents who are observing from the periphery. John observed that a few of them were muttering. Their eyes flitted from Caleb to him. The game commenced. Caleb's talent was immediately apparent. He was entirely concentrated, precise, and swift. By the time of intermission, even the most skeptic parents were compelled to acknowledge the youngster was commendable. However, the air was still dense with tension following the contest. Walking off the court, John observed one of the other parents approaching him. The individual, sporting a baseball cap and a dubious demeanor, he extended his hand. He grumbled, "He possesses genuine talent."
"You ought to be filled with pride." John firmly shook his hand. "I am. He has exerted himself diligently." It was not a comprehensive thought, however it was a beginning. On the day of the town's cleanup, additional progress was achieved. John and the boys joined a group that was assigned to repaint the gazebo. Volunteers congregated in the town square, armed with brooms, refuse bags, and gloves. Mason's chatter filled the air as they labored, eliciting smiles from a few elder volunteers. "Mr. Parker," one woman exclaimed, drying her hands on her apron as she took a break. "Mason has a way of making work feel a little lighter," John responded. "He is a bright child," as he observed Mason laughing as he attempted to paint a straight line on the gazebo handrail. Caleb, who was more reserved, labored attentively beside him, his strokes being even and precise. As the day progressed, an increasing number of individuals began to interact with the lads. One of the elder men nodded in approval as Caleb fixed an unstable bench, demonstrating his talent for carpentry. Mason, on the other hand, was able to coordinate a small group of children to assist in the cleanup of the park. The atmosphere had changed by the end of the day. People were no longer merely tolerating John and the lads. They were beginning to regard them as members of the community. Mason's participation in the town's annual Spring Festival art contest marked the true turning point. He dedicated days to the creation of a painting that honored his deceased parents, capturing their affection and tenderness. John was uncertain about the reception of his submission when he submitted it. Mason's painting was exhibited in the town square in conjunction with others on the day of the festival. People paused to appreciate it, their expressions softening as they comprehended the emotion conveyed by the brushstrokes. Mason's name resonated throughout the square as the victors were announced. John observed a change in the audience as Mason approached to receive his ribbon, and the ovation that ensued was sincere. The boys' delight was contagious, and for the first time the nagging voices of criticism appeared to diminish. Caleb addressed the group during their return home that evening. He whispered, "It feels distinct." John inquired, "What does it mean?" "People," Caleb responded, casting his gaze back toward the plaza, where the festival lights continued to illuminate. "They are not viewing us in the same manner," John grinned. "That is due to the fact that they are beginning to recognize what I see, two exceptional children who are rightfully here." It began as a distant murmur in the late afternoon, the type of storm that the local news had been warning about for days.
The trees in John's backyard were bent as the winds increased, and the sky turned a wounded grey by evening. Caleb and Mason stood by the living room window, their features illuminated by a combination of dread and fascination. Mason inquired, his voice scarcely above a murmur, "Will it be detrimental?" John placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "While storms can be challenging, this residence has endured more severe conditions. We will be able to weather the storm." The electricity briefly flickered before abruptly ceasing. John guided the lads to the basement by grabbing a flashlight. The deafening sound of rain pounding against the roof was punctuated by the occasional crack of branches breaking in the wind. Caleb reclined in close proximity to Mason, his arm forming a protective embrace around his younger sibling. John led the lads upstairs after the tempest had finally subsided. They exited the building to evaluate the extent of the destruction. The yard was littered with branches, shingles were dispersed, and a section of the fence was precariously positioned. A neighbor's roof had partially collapsed across the street. The air was filled with the sound of sirens, as emergency vehicles navigated the inundated streets. John paused for a moment, before turning his attention to the lads. "Let us commence," he declared. "There are individuals who require assistance." The subsequent days were characterized by a flurry of activity. John and the lads dedicated each awake hour to aiding their neighbors with repairs. They distributed supplies from the community center, cleared fallen branches, and hammered plywood over shattered windows. Mason soon became a favorite among the neighbors, as his cheerful demeanor provided a sense of normalcy amidst the pandemonium. He once gave an elderly woman a bottle of water, and she stroked his cheek and said, "You have a kind heart, young man." Caleb, on the other hand, labored assiduously and discreetly. He spent hours assisting John in the repair of roofs and the stabilization of unstable structures, his concentration unwavering. A gruff man who had scarcely acknowledged John before, one of their neighbors, dropped by to express his gratitude. "You are raising good boys," he stated bluntly. John responded, "I am merely assisting them in being who they are." The tempest had brought the municipality together in unexpected ways. Individuals who had previously maintained their distance now collaborated with John and the lads. Mason and Caleb shared tales, and laughed with their peers at the community potluck, which was organized to express gratitude to the volunteers. They appeared to have lived in Springfield their entire lives. The mayor singled out John and the lads when he stood to deliver a speech. "During periods such as these, individuals' genuine natures are revealed," he stated. "John Parker and his sons have demonstrated the importance of compassion for others, regardless of the circumstances." John experienced his family's acceptance by the town for the first time, as a result of the deafening ovation that ensued. Mason gazed upward at John as they dined on the residual potluck dishes at the dining table that evening. He inquired quietly, "Do you believe that our parents would have been proud of us?" John's larynx contracted as he placed his utensil down. He stated, "I am certain that they would have been." His voice was firm. "And I am equally proud of you." Caleb briefly observed Mason, and then John. "We are equally proud of you," he added. John's heart swelled on account of the weight of the words, which were straightforward. John, Caleb, and Mason experienced a significant transformation in the weeks that followed the typhoon. Springfield's previously shuttered doors gradually began to open. Individuals who had previously shied away from them now waved as they passed, and the murmurs of disapproval were replaced by conversations. The municipality was significantly impacted by the family's efforts during the disaster. While Caleb and Mason were engaged in a game of basketball in the driveway on a Saturday, a vehicle approached. Mr. Peterson, who was one of the town's most vocal critics, was the individual in question. He emerged with a compact toolkit in his hand. He said, his tone uncomfortable, "I heard you are repairing that old gazebo down at the park. I was under the impression that you might require an additional pair of hands." John hesitated briefly before extending his own hand. "We could benefit from the assistance," he stated. Mason assisted in the application of a new coat of paint, while Caleb and Mr. Peterson sanded the gazebo railings that afternoon. Mr. Peterson remained on the veranda to share lemonade with the family, and the dilapidated structure was gleaming by the end of the day. This was not an apology, rather it was an initial step toward reconciliation. The town's transformation was not limited to individuals. Mason recommended that a portion of the proceeds from the fundraiser conducted by Caleb's basketball team be allocated to the restoration of the community center's playground. The fundraiser was intended to assist families that were still in the process of recovering from the storm. A few children hesitated when Mason introduced the concept to the group. One youngster inquired, "What if we fail to raise an adequate amount?" Mason smiled, "We will continue until we reach our destination." Even the most resolute hearts were moved by the sight of Mason presenting a check to the director of the community center, as the fundraiser was a resounding success. Not all individuals were as eager to adapt. Mrs. Aldridge, an elderly woman widely recognized for her cutting tongue, addressed her concerns during a town council meeting. "I continue to believe that this is an excessive amount of information, delivered at an excessive pace," she stated. Her words were pointed, but they were devoid of the edge they once possessed. Caleb raised his hand before John could respond. The boy stood, and the room fell quiet. Caleb's voice was composed as he stated, "People are capable of transformation. If we can, you can as well." Mrs. Aldridge reclined in her seat, her expression betraying contemplation, as the straightforward assertion lingered in the air. The town's 4th of July celebration was the genuine moment of transformation. Families from throughout Springfield attended the annual pyrotechnics display, which was a significant event. John, Caleb, and Mason arrived early to assist in the assembly of tables and chairs. People began to congregate in the park as the sun began to set, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Mason was seated on John's knee when the pyrotechnics commenced, and the blasts of light in the heavens illuminated his face. Caleb sat beside them, his demeanor a combination of contentment and astonishment. John surveyed the throng as the final pyrotechnic burst in a silver and gold shower. For the first time, he experienced a sense of belonging to the community, rather than mere toleration. John's torso supported Mason's cranium. "Do we not have a right to be here?" John's eyes were misting as he smiled. "Yes, my friend, we do. With the passage of 10 years, Springfield underwent numerous transformations. Numerous new enterprises had emerged. The playground, which was previously in a state of disrepair, had been transformed into a hive of activity. Additionally, the gazebo that Caleb and Mason had assisted in restoring continued to serve as a testament to their resilient nature. However, it was not solely the tangible transformations of the municipality that were significant, it was the individuals. Over time, John Parker's residence had evolved into a focal point for social gatherings, where children gathered to shop baskets in the driveway, and neighbors felt at home. His sons, who were now adults, had established fulfilling lives for themselves, while continuing to apply the lessons acquired in the small home located at the terminus of the gravel road. Caleb, who is now 20 years old, was pursuing a degree in architecture at the University of Kansas. He frequently returned home on weekends to assist with community initiatives. His designs are instrumental in the realization of novel concepts. He has recently completed a town mural that includes images of the tempest and the subsequent recovery, which recognized the unity that had developed in its wake. Mason, who was 17 years old, had pursued an alternative course of action. With his innate charisma and capacity to establish connections with others, he directed juvenile outreach initiatives at the neighborhood community center. He labored assiduously to guarantee that children from all walks of life had the chance to flourish, providing mentorship and coordinating events that facilitated the bridging of divides. The municipality assembled at the community center for a dedication ceremony on a balmy summer evening. A plaque was unveiled, which read, "In recognition of the Parker family's contribution to our understanding of the concept of community." John remained at the rear of the audience, his arms crossed, as he observed his son speak. Caleb discussed the significance of creating environments that foster community, while Mason recounted anecdotes about the children with whom he had collaborated, and the impact that a small act of compassion could have. Caleb discovered John near the food tables after the speeches concluded. "We would not have been able to accomplish any of this without your assistance," he stated. John's voice was subdued as he shook his head. "No, my son. Both of you defined your own trajectories. I have simply provided you with the necessary resources." Mason approached the crowd with 2 pies in his hand as it dispersed. "I reserved the final pieces for us," he stated with a grimace.
John chuckled as he retrieved a plate. It is comforting to know that certain things remain constant. The three individuals dined in comfortable solitude on a bench adjacent to the playground. The first stars appeared, glittering faintly above, as the sky darkened. Caleb abruptly stated, "I believe my mother would have been pleased." His voice was hushed. John gazed at his sons, his chest expanding with pride. "She would have been. Likewise I am." None of them spoke for a brief period. The air was filled with the distant sounds of merriment and conversation, serving as a reminder of the significant progress they had all made. Both Caleb and Mason had developed into men of integrity and compassion, leaving a legacy of their own. John came to the realization that the structure he had constructed was decaying as the night progressed. Was not merely a residence for two boys. It served as a foundation for a more promising future that would extend far beyond Springfield.